I stood in front of the supermarket shelf longer than I expected. A small item rested in my hand, yet I still couldn't decide whether to place it in my cart. A few years ago, decisions like this barely slowed me down. Now, even simple choices seem to take more time than they used to. I checked the price tag one more time before returning the item to the shelf. It wasn't because we couldn't afford it. I was simply afraid of making the wrong choice. That feeling appeared more often than I realized. It followed me through major decisions, small decisions, and even things that should have felt simple. My name is Clara. After the financial setback our family went through, I realized I had lost something more valuable than money, the trust I once had in myself. The morning unfolded the way it usually did. I prepared breakfast while Mira got ready for school, and Armand checked his work schedule. Everything looked normal from the outside. Yet one question stayed quietly in my mind. Was this decision really the right one? When I opened our family finance app, I found myself reviewing the same numbers again. My eyes moved across figures I already knew by heart. Nothing had changed since the last time I checked. There was no new problem, yet I kept looking anyway. I told myself it was simply being careful, but little by little, I started wondering if it might actually be fear. Even small expenses began to feel like a test. Simple choices carried more weight than they used to, and beneath every decision was the same concern. I was always afraid of getting it wrong again. A few days later, I started noticing something I hadn't paid attention to before. The feeling was quiet, but it kept returning during ordinary moments. I realized how often I was asking Armand about things I once decided on my own. The pattern appeared more clearly each day. It wasn't only about important decisions. Even simple household purchases, broken appliances, or Mira's school needs made me pause. "Do you think we really need this?" became a question I asked again and again. The words came naturally before I made a choice. Armand usually responded without much thought. His tone stayed easy and relaxed. "It's up to you, Clara," he would say. The answer always sounded simple. Strangely, those words never brought relief. Instead, I felt even less certain after hearing them. One evening, after the house had grown quiet, I opened an old financial notebook. The worn pages carried records I had not looked at in a long time. Those notes came from a period when several decisions had not gone the way we hoped. Looking at them brought me back to that chapter of our lives. The numbers were still there, exactly as they had been. The mistakes remained part of the record, unchanged by time. I sat there for a while, reading the pages without turning away. The longer I looked, the more familiar they felt. As I continued looking at those records, a different thought began to surface. It arrived quietly, without changing anything on the page. Even though our situation had improved over the years, I realized I was still responding to myself the same way. The past seemed to follow me into decisions that belonged to the present. It felt as though one old mistake had become proof that I could not fully trust myself. That belief had stayed with me longer than I realized. The days kept moving forward in their usual rhythm. From the outside, nothing seemed very different from before. Little by little, our emergency fund was growing again. The numbers were moving upward, even if only in small steps. Old debts were becoming smaller month after month. The burden was still there, but it no longer looked as heavy as before. Our spending had become more controlled than before. Everyday choices felt more deliberate and measured. Looking at the facts alone, we were moving in a better direction. The progress was visible in ways I could not deny. Yet, I did not feel better, along with the numbers. Something inside me remained unchanged. The fear was still living quietly inside my mind. Even as life improved around me, it had not left. It was a quiet afternoon when we stopped by a school supply store. Everything felt ordinary, yet my thoughts remained heavier than the moment itself. Mira suddenly stopped in front of a display and picked out a pencil case she liked. Her attention settled on it immediately. She carried it over to me with bright eyes and quiet excitement. For a moment, she seemed completely certain about what she wanted. I looked at the price tag and read it twice. It wasn't expensive, and it still fit comfortably within our budget. Even so, I stood there without saying anything. The pause lasted longer than it should have. Mira tilted her head and looked at me carefully. Then she quietly asked, "Why are you always afraid to buy something now?" Her words stopped me for a moment, not because of the question itself, but because I already knew the answer. That night, I kept thinking about what Mira had said earlier. Her simple words stayed with me long after the house became quiet. As I sat with those thoughts, I admitted something to myself. It was a truth I had been avoiding for a long time. I realized I was no longer living inside the financial problem itself. The situation had changed, even if my mind had not. What remained was something older than the problem itself. I was still living with the fear that came from that period. The mistakes from those years were already behind us. They belonged to a chapter that had ended, yet part of me kept returning to them. I was still holding myself responsible long after the moment had passed. Without realizing it, I had stopped trusting my own judgment. Somewhere along the way, I began doubting my ability to make good decisions. After Mira went to sleep, the house became quiet again. I sat with Armand and finally brought up something I had been carrying for a long time. I told him everything that had been circling in my mind. The words came slowly, but I did not hold them back. I spoke about the fear that never seemed to disappear completely. Even during calmer days, it always stayed somewhere in the background. I admitted how often I questioned my own judgment. Decisions that once felt simple now seemed harder than they should. Armand listened without interrupting. He simply stayed present while I finished saying what I needed to say. When I finished, he spoke calmly. He said that I kept remembering the mistakes we had made before. Then he reminded me of something else. He said I rarely noticed the many good decisions I had made since then. The next morning, I decided to begin with one small habit. It wasn't a big change, just something simple I could do every day. Every evening, I wrote down one good decision I had made that day. Seeing it on paper felt different from only thinking about it. Some days, the entry was as simple as saying no to a purchase I didn't really need. Nothing dramatic happened, but I still wrote it down. Other days, it was choosing to follow the budget we had already planned. I simply stayed with the decision we had made earlier. Sometimes the good decision was simply not panicking when an unexpected expense appeared. I noticed that reaction before it carried me away. Day after day, the list became longer. The pages slowly filled with small moments I might have overlooked before. And little by little, I began to notice something I had been overlooking. I was growing. I didn't suddenly become confident again. The uncertainty was still there, even after things had started to improve. There were still days when old fears returned without warning. They would quietly follow me through ordinary moments. But now I could see the difference. I no longer treated those old mistakes as part of who I was. I learned that trust didn't return through one big decision. It grew from small choices repeated day after day. Maybe after a financial setback, the first thing we rebuild isn't our savings. Maybe it's the belief that we can make a slightly better choice than yesterday.